Sign of Beaver, Chapter 15. On the day of their greatest adventure, Etienne had come without his dog, so there was no warning. Matt was in fine spirits that day because he had managed, by a magnificent stroke of luck, to hit a rabbit with his bow and arrow. It was the first time this had happened, and it was more the rabbit's doing than his own. The silly creature had just sat there and let him take careful aim. All the same, he was pleased with himself, and even more pleased that Etienne had been there to see it. When the boys decided to visit the beaver dam again, Matt was unwilling to leave the rabbit behind in case some thieving animal should discover it. He was walking behind Etienne, swinging the rabbit carelessly by the ears, as Etienne always did, when the Indian suddenly halted, his whole body tensed. Matt could see nothing unusual, and he had opened his mouth to speak when Etienne silenced him with a jerk of his hand. Then he heard a sound in the underbrush ahead, not a rustle like a grouse or a snake, not a trapped animal. This was a stirring of something moving slowly and heavily. He felt a cold prickle in his stomach. He stood beside Etienne, his own muscles tight, scarcely breathing. A low bush bent sideways. Through the leaves a brown head thrust itself, bigger than that of a dog and shaggier. It was a small bear cub. Matt could see the little eyes peering at them curiously, the brown nose wrinkling at the strange smell of human boy. The little animal looked so comical that Matt almost laughed out loud. "Sst!" Etienne warned under his breath. There was a crashing of bush and a low, snarling growl. An immense paw reached through the thicket and tumbled the cub over and out of sight. In its place loomed a huge brown shape. Bursting through the leaves was a head 3 times as big as the cub's. No curiosity in those small eyes, only an angry, reddish gleam. Somehow Matt had the sense not to run. He stood frozen on the path. A bear could overtake a running man in a few bounds, and this one was only 2 bounds away. The bear's head moved slowly from side to side. Its heavy body brushed aside the branches as though they were cobwebs. It swayed, shifting its weight from one foot to the other. Slowly it rose on its hind legs. Matt could see the wicked curving claws. Matt would never know why he acted as he did. He could not remember thinking at all, only staring with numb horror at the creature about to charge. Somehow he did move. He swung the dead rabbit by its ears and hurled it straight at the bear's head. The tiny body struck the bear squarely on its nose. With a jerk of her head, the bear shook it off as though it were a buzzing mosquito. The rabbit flopped useless to the ground. The bear did not even bother to look down at it. She had been distracted for only an instant, but in that instant something flashed through the air. There was a sharp twang and a dull thud of a blow. Just between the eyes of the bear, the shaft of Etienne's arrow quivered. As the waving forepaws began to lower, a second arrow struck just below the bear's shoulder. The great head shuddered and sank toward the ground. With a wild yell, Etienne sprang forward and thrust his knife deep, just behind his first arrow. Still scarcely aware that he moved at all, Matt leaped after him, jerking his own knife from his belt. He sank it into brown fur. His blow had been misplaced, but it was not needed. The bear's sides were heaving. The boys stood watching, and in a few moments it lay still. Matt stared at the creature in horror. The fearsome yellow teeth were still bared in a snarl. Saliva and blood dribbled down from the open jaws. The little eyes that had glittered so savagely were filmed over. The long, sharp claws hung powerless, clotted with pawed up earth. Now that there was nothing to fear, Matt felt his knees shaking. He hoped that Etienne would not notice. and he managed a wide grin to hide his trembling, but ATN did not grin back. He stood over the bear and he began to speak, slowly and solemnly, in his own tongue. He spoke for some time. "What were you saying?" Matt demanded when the speaking was over. "I tell bear I do not want to kill," ATN answered. "Indian not kill she bear with cub. I tell bear we did not come here to hunt. But it might have killed us both. Maybe. I asked bear to forgive that I must kill." "Well, I'm mighty thankful you did," Matt said stoutly. He was about to say that he had never been so scared in his life, but he thought better of it. ATN looked at him, and his solemnness suddenly dissolved into a grin. "You move quick," he said, "like Indian." Matt felt his cheeks turn red. "You killed him," he said honestly, yet he knew that he had had a part in it. He had given ATN just that instant in which to notch his arrow. ATN nudged the bear with his toe. "Small," he said, "just some fat. Good for eat." Small? That monstrous creature? It certainly was too big for two boys to carry. It appeared that ATN had no intention of trying. "Belong squaw now," he said. "I go tell." "You mean a squaw is going to carry that heavy thing?" "Cut up meat, then carry. Squaw work," ATN answered. It was plain that he had done the man's work and was finished with it. The cub, Matt remembered now. It was nowhere in sight. ATN shook his head. "Let cub go," he said. "When Sigwam come again, him plenty big to eat." "Take rabbit," ATN reminded him. Matt looked with distaste at the rabbit, almost covered by the bear's heavy paw, the fur matted and bloody. He would rather not have touched it, but obediently he pulled it out. It was his dinner after all, and he knew that in ATN's world everything that was killed must be used. The Indians did not kill for sport. When ATN had disappeared into the forest, Matt still stood looking down at the first bear he had ever seen. He felt resentful. ATN had killed the bear, of course. It was his by right. But Matt would have liked just a small share of that meat, or even one of those big claws to show his father. Then he remembered the Indian boy's tribute. He had moved fast, like an Indian. That would have to be it. That would have to be share enough. Chapter 16. In the late afternoon, Matt sat in the cabin doorway. He couldn't think of any work to do. He felt ready. He needed to talk to someone. He wanted to tell his father about the bear. Thinking of his father, he felt that snake. The meeting with the bear had shaken Matt's trust in the forest. Now it seemed to close him in on every side, dark and threatening around his chest. Matt stared at the hideously painted face. Then he recognized ATN, a very different ATN from the boy who had walked with him in the forest that morning. The Indian boy had washed his body, and it shone with fresh grease. He had combed his tangled black locks. Down his cheeks on either side and on his forehead ran broad streaks of blue and white paint. On a cord around his neck dangled a row of new bear's claws. In case ATN had noticed his first alarm, Matt greeted him boldly. "What's the war paint for?" he demanded. "Not war paint," ATN answered. "Squaws make feast with bear. My grandfather say you come." Matt hesitated, unable to believe his ears. It took him a moment to realize that this was actually an invitation. "Thanks," he stammered. "I'd sure like some of that bear meat. Wait till I get my jacket." "Shut door," ATN reminded him. "Maybe another bear come." ATN was in good humor. He had made one of his unexpected jokes. "Long way," ATN said. Matt was certain they must have been walking more than an hour. He remembered that ATN had already walked all this way to fetch him, and he kept silent. It was so dark now that he could barely see to put one foot before the other, but he realized that they were on a well-beaten trail. Just as the last light was glinting above the treetops, they reached a riverbank. Drawn up at its edge was a small birch canoe. Etienne motioned him to step into it. Then he gave a push and leaped nimbly into the stern. His paddle moved soundlessly. Grateful to sit still, Matt was entranced by the speed, the silence, the gliding shadows on the silver river. He was regretful when, in a very few strokes, they reached the other side. Now Matt could see a glimmer of light deep in the woods. Etienne led him toward it, and presently their way was barred by a solid wall of upright posts, a stockade. For the first time, a quiver of uneasiness made Matt falter, but stronger than any doubt, curiosity drove him on. Not for one moment would he have turned back. Eagerly he followed Etienne through a gateway into an open space filled with smoke and moving shadows and wavering patches of light cast by birch bark torches. All around him, in a circle, rose the dim shapes of cabins and cone-shaped wigwams. In the center of the circle, a long, narrow fire was burning between walls of logs. Suspended on timbers hung three iron pots, sending up rosy curls of steam in the smoky air. The fragrance of boiling meat and the pungent herbs made Matt's stomach crawl. Then he was aware of the Indians. They sat silently on either side of the fire, their painted faces ghastly in the flickering light. They were clad in an odd medley of garments, some in Englishmen's coats and jackets, others with bright blankets draping their shoulders. A few had feathers standing straight up from their headbands. Everywhere there was the gleam of metal on arms and chests. Women in bright cloth skirts and odd pointed caps moved about without a sound, adding wood to the fire or stirring the contents of the kettles. Light glinted on their silver armbands and necklaces. Clearly, the Indians had put on their finest array for this feast. It came over Matt with a rush of shame how very shabby he must look in their eyes. Even if Etienne had warned him, what could he have done? He had no other clothes to wear. Probably Etienne had known that, and so had said nothing. No one seemed to notice him, yet he was conscious of the unblinking stare of the row facing him. The others did not turn their heads. They seemed to be waiting. In the silence, Matt's heart beat so loudly they all surely must have heard it. After a long pause, one man rose slowly and came toward him. It was Saknisse, his paint-streaked face barely recognizable. He wore a long red coat decorated by a handsome beaded collar and metal armbands. A crown of feathers rose from the beaded band around his forehead. He stood very tall, and there was pride in his stern features. Why, Matt thought, he looked like a king. "Que," Saknisse said with dignity, "white boy welcome." In a sudden terrifying yell, the rows of Indians echoed this greeting. "Tahoe!" they shouted. "Tahoe! Yea, hi, hi!" "Que," Matt stammered in return. Then more boldly, "Que!" The Indians seemed satisfied. Smiles flashed in their dark faces. There was rough laughter, and then, seeming to forget him, they began to jabber to each other. From nowhere, children suddenly crowded around him, giggling, daring each other to touch him. Matt's heart slowed its pounding. There was nothing to fear in this place, but after the weeks of stillness in his cabin, the noise was confusing. He was grateful when Etienne came to his rescue and led him to a seat at the end of a log. An old woman approached and held out to him a gourd cup. It contained a sweetish drink, acid and flavored with maple sugar, good on his dry tongue. Saknisse raised his arm, and instantly the clamor was silenced. There was no doubt Etienne's grandfather was the leader here. An Indian brought him a long pipe, and Saknisse put it to his lips and slowly blew out a long wreath of smoke. The rows of Indians waited respectfully for him to speak. Instead, the old man turned to his grandson and held out the pipe. Etienne stepped into the center of the clearing. In the firelight he stood straight and slender, his bare arms and legs gleaming. Matt had never seen him like this. Proudly he took the pipe, set it briefly to his own lips, and handed it back to his grandfather. Then he began to speak. Matt did not need to understand the words. He soon realized that ATN was recounting the morning's adventure. Watching his gestures, Matt felt himself living again the walk through the woods, the meeting with the small cub, the fearsome mother about to charge. As ATN spoke, the Indians urged the boy on with grunts and shouts of approval and pleasure. ATN tensed his body. He uttered a sharp cry, pointed at Matt, and then made a flinging sweep of his arm, hurling an imaginary rabbit. The seated figures broke into loud cries, shouting, "He!" grinning and pointing at Matt, swinging their arms in imitation. Matt's cheeks were hot. He knew they were making fun of him, but boisterous as it was, the sound was friendly. Now they turned back to ATN and followed his story with growing excitement. ATN certainly made a very good story of it. His telling took a lot longer than the actual event. Plainly, they all enjoyed it, and in listening, they were all taking part in it. ATN was a skillful storyteller. Matt could understand now just how he must have delighted them with his acting out of Robinson Crusoe. When the narrative was over, the Indians sprang to their feet. They formed a long line. They began a sound that sent a tingle, half dread and half pleasure, down Matt's spine. A lone Indian had leaped to the head of the line, beating a rattle against his palm in an odd, stirring rhythm. He strutted and pranced in ridiculous contortions, for all the world like a clown in a village fair. The line of figures followed after him, aping him and stamping their feet in response. ATN was at his side again. "Dance now," he said, "then feast." The rhythm of the rattle quickened. The line of the figures wove round the fire faster and faster. Women joined now, at the end of the line, linking their arms, swaying. Finally, the children, even small children, were dancing, stamping their small naked feet. "Dance," ATN commanded. He seized Matt's arm and pulled him into the moving line. The men near him cheered him on, laughing at Matt's stumbling attempts. Once he caught his breath, Matt found it simple to follow the step. His confidence swelled as the rhythm throbbed through his body, loosening his tight muscles. He was suddenly filled with excitement and happiness. His own heels pounded against the hard ground. He was one of them. He came back to earth with a stitch in his side. His legs threatened to give way under him. The dancing seemed to have no end. Determined that ATN should not see him weakening, he moved faster and stamped harder. Finally, when he felt he could not make the circle one more time, the dance ended. The feasting began. A squaw brought him a wooden bowl filled with thick, hot stew and a curiously carved wooden spoon. The first steaming mouthful burned his tongue, but he was too hungry to wait. He thought nothing had ever tasted so good, dark and greasy and spicy, so this was bear meat. Presently he noticed that ATN sat beside him, eating nothing. "You're not eating," he said with a sudden doubt. "Have you given me your share?" "This my bear," the boy answered. "I kill, not eat. Maybe not get any more bear." He didn't sound as if he minded in the least, as if in fact he was proud of not eating. When Matt's bowl was empty, the squaw refilled it. By the time he finished, sleepiness began to drag at his eyelids. He could scarcely hold them open. ATN seemed in no hurry to leave. The Indians were enjoying themselves, refilling their bowls, shouting at each other, laughing and slapping their legs at what seemed to be uproarious jokes. This was noisier than any celebration Matt had ever seen in Quincy, even on muster day. What had he ever had? Why had he ever had the idea that the Indians were a dull lot? At last, however, they fell silent, and Matt saw that one of them was beginning another story. It promised to be a long one. Between the sentences, the speaker drew on his pipe, and the smoke curled from his nose and mouth as he spoke. Matt's head drooped and came up with a painful jerk. He had almost fallen asleep sitting up. ATN laughed and motioned him to his feet. At the thought of tramping all the way back to the cabin, Matt groaned. It must be close to midnight. Then he saw that ATN did not mean to go back. He led Matt toward one of the wigwams and pulled back the flap of deerskin that hung across the door. Inside, a small fire burned, and by its faint light, Matt saw a low platform covered with matting and fur. ATN made a silent motion, and Matt, too sleepy to question, gratefully let his tired body sink down on the soft skins. ATN stirred up the fire and left him alone. Once, long after, Matt roused to hear the rattle and the pounding of feet. The Indians were dancing again, and he was thankful to stay right where he was.